You're listening to the Stable Management Podcast, where we discuss the barn management topics that you're passionate about.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Stable Management Podcast. Our goal is to bring you a real-world look into the parts of horse farm management that you love or hate most, such as stall bedding, farm equipment, and pasture maintenance. During each bi-monthly episode, we'll be joined by an expert guest who shares their experiences with and perspectives on an important stable management topic. I'm your host, Hailey Kerstetter, and my guest today is Lee McKeever, show barn manager at Castle Hill Farm in Brewster, New York, and Wellington, Florida. Thank you so much for joining me today, Lee.
Hi, Hailey. Glad to join.
So today we're going to be talking about traveling with horses and caring for them on the road as people start to look towards their summer plans. But before we jump into that, could you just tell us a bit about how you got started at Castle Hill and your role there?
I came to America 38 years ago. I started working for McLean's father here at Castle Hill Farm. And initially I stayed at home and just rode and general everyday looking out, taking care of horses. And then McLean came and I started looking after show horses. And we just kind of grew together, started traveling the world, competing. And it's been a great partnership so far.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little bit about what your day-to-day might look like now? And you can share a little bit at home and on the road if that's easier.
Our day normally starts at 7 a.m. at home when we're not showing. Everybody mucks out. We all sit down and have breakfast together after mucking out. And then there will be a list done of what the horses' activities are going to be for the day. And we get on and do that for all day. And then it varies when we're on the road at a show because the schedule changes a lot and different class times, and it depends on the show. And I organize everything on the show end of it, the traveling, the setting up, the care, the maintenance of the show horses.
Awesome. Well, that's a perfect segue into my first question about our topic, and that is, what are the key things that you consider when you're preparing a horse to travel to a competition?
The first thing I think you've got to take into consideration is how far the trip's going to be, and also the weather and the conditions and which horses you're taking to the show. All the horses are very different. They all travel differently. They've all got their own quirks. And the distance, I think, is the main thing on planning for your trip.
So how do you ensure that your horses stay hydrated during long trips, since we're on that topic?
If, for example, if we're going on a long trip, I normally like to double their electrolytes a couple of days out just to make sure they're drinking at home. And then on occasions, we've got one or two horses that do not drink while they're shipping. So I will give them IV fluids before the trip starts.
Okay, and do you offer them water during the trip typically, or does that really depend on the length of the trip?
No, every time our horses go on the truck, there's a water bucket hung in front of them. I think it's very important horses stay hydrated while they travel.
Definitely, for sure. I've heard that theme from several of my guests, regardless of the topic.
And on occasion, we'll soak a hay net overnight, so there's more hydration in that for the ones that really do not like to drink.
Oh, perfect. That's a really good tip. I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah.
So on the topic of nutrition, what is your feeding routine like when you're away from home? Do you adjust anything, or do you try to keep it very similar for the horses?
I think when the horses are traveling and competing, I like to give them a little bit of extra food because it's a different. I think horses when they're at home, kind of their metabolism slows down a little bit. They don't burn as much calories, but once you start shipping and competing, they start burning a little bit more calories, and I like to give them a little bit more intake when they're competing.
For sure. And if you have any horses that don't like to drink, like you just said, do you ever soak their feed to help them get more water in, or they tend to not like that?
It depends on the horse. Some do. If I sometimes there's a vitamin you can put in the water that encourages them to drink, which helps a lot of them. And there's I sometimes put carrots or apples in their water bucket, which makes them go into the water bucket and they're drinking a little bit at the same time.
That's a really good idea. I haven't tried that before, but I've seen a few people who like to try it and they have good success with it.
Yeah, it's worked well with certain horses.
So, how do you monitor your horse's condition or their stress levels when they're away at shows?
I think certain horses drop weight when they travel, and some of our horses, like Elix, doesn't. When he gets to a show, he's very finicky and he doesn't like to eat. So you kind of plan ahead. Maybe the week before, you give them a little bit more feed at home. So if they do drop condition, it doesn't make that much of an impact on their performance. Um, I, you get to know them and you stay on top of their little quirks.
For sure. And do you have any that they may be stressed ahead of time and there's something else that you might do to prepare them for that change? Or is it really just something that you have to manage in the moment at the competition?
I think honestly, nowadays, these horses travel so much and compete so much that it used to be a big factor. But the horses have adapted to this way of life and seem to handle it much better nowadays. So you don't struggle into the box walking, the weaving, or the upsetting when they get to. They were handling it so much better nowadays.
Yeah, for sure. I always remember when I was managing a farm, we had several horses who would walk into the stall, and it was like they had been there a million times. They tend to be used to it no matter where we were going. So that always takes a little bit of the pressure off of you too, as a person in charge of them.
Yeah, for sure.
So if you do have a horse who's nervous or unsettled when you get there, maybe you didn't expect them to be like that and it surprised you. Do you have any tips for managing that and helping them to relax?
Often I find is when they get upset is when they think they're by themselves. So if you can let them see another horse or put them next to their partner from home, or just leave their stall open with a stall guard in front of it so they can see the other horses, they relax a lot better. Also, hay net seems to help a lot.
For sure. And do you find that getting them out of the stall to like hand walk or lunge or maybe go for a hack helps, or does that tend to sometimes make it worse?
It depends on the horse. We've got a couple of horses that like to get out once. If they're in the stall and they won't relax, we'll take them out and let them trot around on the lunge line so they relax a little bit more. Um, Hand walking them, grazing them seems to make them relax. But nowadays they adapt to it so much easier that they know they're at a show.
For sure. My horse now is kind of like that, where he's pretty okay with just getting off the trailer and relaxing wherever he is. But previously, I had one that needed a day or two to settle in, and sometimes we would plan ahead and try to get her there a little bit early if we could. Do you guys ever have
For
to use
sure.
that tactic?
For sure, with the young horses, I think it plays big in their development. Instead of just coming in the day of, if you can get there 1 or 2 days so they can adapt to the environment, the situation, it helps. Mainly, you see it more with young horses that haven't traveled as much. So I would plan ahead and get there 1 or 2 days ahead if possible, just to let them accumulate and get used to their surroundings.
Even under the best circumstances, travel is stressful for horses. We've all been there, stuck on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. You can make the journey knowing that US Rider is there for you. Get peace of mind on the road with US Rider's nationwide 24/7 roadside assistance coverage for both you and your horse. Join today at usrider.org.
So, when you're developing your show schedule, how do you take the individual horse's needs into consideration for that? Because I know that's really a challenge, especially when you have many different personalities in the barn. It can be really hard to manage all of those.
For sure. Well, McLean is excellent at his schedule. And what we'll do is maybe every month, or if it's an Olympic year or a World Cup year or whatever championships is, we work backwards from there. So we'll sit down and we'll have a meeting. We'll discuss each horse, what its goals for the year are, where it's going to peak, which shows are we going to go to practice, and what the goal is for each individual horse, where you want them to perform their best, where you want them to peak, where we're going to let them down to relax, where they can be horses. And I think, you know, you've got to think where your goal is for each individual horse, even if it's just competing at a lower level. Where is the most important show you want the performance to be at? And I think you've got to start planning maybe 3 or 4 months out.
That's a really good point. One of my other guests mentioned how to have your horse peak at the right time. And I found that topic really interesting because it's not something that I personally have had to manage on my own without assistance. So I thought that was fascinating listening to the thought process on that.
Well, if you think about it, the horses are top athletes, and nobody can perform at their peak for a long time. So you've got to think of recovery time, building time, allow for problems. And I think you've got to very plan in every little thing that can go well and that can go wrong. So you've also got a backup plan. And I think each horse, as you get to know them, has a different kind of plan. And do they need to be fitter before they go to an event? Some horses are a little too fit, so you back down before you go to the show. Other horses need to be fitter, so you step up their cardio before the show. And as you get to know them, you can make a better plan for your each horse for each event.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think, taking the individual horse into consideration is important no matter what you're doing, and having a plan B and maybe also a plan C, because I think if we know anything about horses, it's that things probably won't go according to our first plan.
For sure. And a plan D.
Yeah, definitely. So after the show, how do you handle post-travel recovery for the horses in your care?
Um, if we're going home, um, we really like to turn out as soon as we can when they get home, just to let them down, give them a little relaxing time. So we'll give them 2 to 3 days to relax, recover. Um, Depends how stressful, how high the competition was. Do they need some lactinase for their muscles, extra electrolytes? Um, or if we're going to another show, it's harder to let them down. But we always like to come home and let them be horses for 2 or 3, 4 days before the next event.
That's great. Yeah, something that I've been looking into with writing specifically. I wrote a few articles about recovery recently, and I think that was so interesting to learn about the importance of recovery and how to time it well so that it works for your horse and it preserves their long-term soundness and their mental state so they still enjoy their work. So I think that's so important.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if it doesn't work for everybody, that's our program. It's worked very well for us. I think, they're they're animals. They need their body needs to recover. Their mind needs to recover. They're just like humans. They've got to be in a good place. And I think you've got to have a healthy environment for them to relax and refuel themselves before the next event.
Definitely, yeah. I like that you compared it to humans. It's so true, the top human athletes still need time to rest and recover and, stay happy in their work.
For sure. They're horses, but they've got very different personalities. Every single, I can't name one horse that's the same. So, as your system goes, I think you've got to build a system for each horse individually. I mean, mentally, physically, they're all different. What works for one doesn't work for every single horse. So I think in your program, you've got to allow for every kind of personality a horse can have to be successful. I mean, If you treat everyone the exact same, you're not going to get the same performance out of every single horse. If you treat them as an individual, and I think they can reach their potential much easier and quicker.
Yes, for sure. That's such a great point. Thank you. So, my last question for you is what are some common mistakes that people make when traveling with horses, and how could they be avoided?
The most common mistake I see from my point of view is people over blanketing their horses when they're shipping. I mean, I'd like to err on the side of them being a little colder than a little hotter, because you run into the problem of them sweating, then breaking a fever, getting dehydrated. I find some people put too many rugs on, and you run into huge problems that way. And I think you've always got to have fresh water and a small amount of hay. I don't think a lot of hay, because if you're going on a long trip and they just stand there eating and eating, it's also not healthy. I think you've got to give them a little bit every so often just to keep their system moving.
Definitely, yeah. I see a lot of people make that blanketing mistake when they're traveling between different climates. So if they're coming from up north where it's really cold and they're going down south, they blanket the
Yes.
horse as though they're staying in that very cold temperature the whole time, and then they end up, yeah, sweaty and dehydrated.
Yeah, for sure. I see a lot of people run into a big problem with that. And then the horses get off the truck, they're fine for an hour, but then spike a huge fever. I mean, when you think about it yourself, there's more chance of getting sick when you're sweating the whole time than being a little chill. I don't think they've got to be freezing, but I mean, just you've got to allow for the climate, especially in America, where you travel from state to state to state and they change. I think you've got to allow for temperature change and be very aware of taking on and off blankets as they ship.
Definitely, yeah. I'm really glad you brought up that point. That's a good one. So, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. It feels like our time has flown by today, but it's been great talking with you today, Lee. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you. It was a pleasure.
And thank you all for listening today. Please remember to like this podcast, subscribe, leave a review, and recommend the Stable Management podcast to a friend.